Welcome to the Libertarian Institute YouTube and Odyssey channel. Today, Sheldon Richmond and I, my colleague at the Libertarian Institute, are going to go over three things that we think are pretty valuable for people to check out. Sheldon, The World at War by Ralph Raico. What is this one?
Well, this is a YouTube lecture. Actually, it's two lectures on the schedule at this seminar that it was held at. It was, two distinct lectures with a regular kind of break in between. So that's why it seems so long. You may not want to sit down and watch it all at one time, three hours. But it's an oldie, but definitely a goodie. It was given in the 1980s. So we might know some new things that he didn't know, but this is Ralph Raico. Ralph Raico was one of the great libertarian scholars and kind of an activist also. I knew him well. He was a friend of mine. I knew him at the Institute for Humane Studies and just through other things. And he was a historian at the SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York, Buffalo. I think maybe it's called the University of Buffalo now. I'm not sure, or Buffalo State University. And he taught there a very long time, very well-read man. He was a diplomatic historian, so he was a historian of, diplomatic historian, intellectual historian too, a historian of ideas. But these lectures are on the world at war, and so it's about the two world wars, which is, might be, I think, very good insight for younger people who maybe not spend as much time thinking about that stuff. It seems so long ago. And also, as a build-up to it, he talks about the decline of classical liberalism, the precursor to libertarianism. In other words, beginning in the 19th century, which in some ways was a kind of a liberal century, the Enlightenment and those things, despite the very bad contradictions in some places, like slavery in the United States. And tariffs and things like that. But there were certainly trends in Europe that seemed to be going strong. In England in particular, France, even in Germany, there were signs of liberalism. But all this began to come to an end as the 19th century closed. And he talks about this. And then he talks about what's happening with balance of power in Europe, as coinciding with the decline of liberalism, arms races, treaties and alliances, entangling alliances, secret alliances in some cases, all culminating in the horror of World War I, which has really changed the world. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And he will drive this home for you. And then, of course, U.S. entry into it, which didn't have to happen at all. Of course, the war itself didn't have to happen. But he'll talk about Wilson's deceptions and the U.S. Getting in. And in the second part, he's then talking about, he talks a little bit about what happens between the wars. And then he talks about the buildup to World War II, and especially then he talks about Pearl Harbor, and then the U.S. and what was going on behind it. The U.S. policymakers believing that war with Japan was inevitable. We hear kind of things today with China, war with China being inevitable, war with Iran being inevitable. There's always a war that's inevitable because policymakers want it. And so it's a great story. He's a very good, relaxed, as you can kind of see there. He's not waving his arms or anything. A little bit, he waved his arms. He's a very sort of laid back but rigorous scholar. And what he's saying is informed by the great libertarian classical liberal tradition. I mean, he studied under Hayek, he great regard for Mises, was friends with Murray Rothbard and a lot of other key libertarians. So I recommend watching this. Watch it in parts because it is long, but I think you will learn a lot, and you may want to even go on to read things that he recommends.
My first one this week, the rich get richer myth. This is one that we hear all the time. Thankfully, Chelsea Follett from humanprogress.org wrote an article titled High Turnover Among America's Rich. Going to the science, as the progressives love to tell us, she says, some 94% of Americans who reach top 1% income status will enjoy it for only a single year. Approximately 99% will lose their top 1% status within a decade. Now, consider the top 400 US income earners, a far more exclusive club than the top 1%. Between 1992 and 2013, 72% of the top 400 retained that title for no more than a year. Over 97% retained it for no more than a decade. Excellent work for Human Progress, smashing the statist myth that always justifies further and further state intervention. To which people will almost always respond, well, you could never spend all that money. Why is it okay for someone to have it? As if it's under a mattress, as if it's not being invested and given out in the form of loans by banks or anything, or in the stock market. Here is how Jason Brennan responds to this criticism.
There's these arguments that basically say, if you're rich, you should give it all away, because how can you live high while other people die? And one of the things I do with that is to point out that the reason some of us are living high is in part because we haven't worked on this attitude of you just need to give it all away. So it is true that there are people that are starving right now and you could save them. There are people who are blind and you could save them. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I think it is worth helping some of these people in these circumstances. But the reality is the why don't we give it all away attitude has never put people in a position where they're in a position to help. Right. Back in 1971, the philosopher Peter Singer writes a paper arguing that you should give away almost all of your income to help others. And basically, no one listens to Peter Singer. And as a result, South Korea goes from being a poor country to being a rich country in 25 years because people didn't listen to him. And instead, they bought VCRs and cars and stereos and other kinds of things. So it's important to recognize that trade and investment are the things that actually liberate people to be rich and put them in the position to wonder how much they should help people. The let's help everyone it's like that never actually succeeds in lifting a country out of poverty, never actually succeeds in creating prosperity. What it does do is stop people in some cases from starving to death. And we should be aware that that's all it really does.
That is Jason Brennan in an interview talking about his book, Why It's Okay to Want to Be Rich. Sheldon, what is the Hong Konger?
Well, I'm writing about this this week. It'll appear in my Friday article of this week. This is a story about a man named Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai just won that's him right there. He just won the Cato Institute's Milton Friedman Prize for advancing liberty. And he's a very important person in this sense. I mean, in many senses, but in the one I want to draw attention to. He is certainly not the only individual being, really badly oppressed by the Chinese government, but he may be the best known. Here's a man who was born poor in China, on the mainland, and that I think around age 12, he ends up stowing away and gets to Hong Kong, the island part of Hong Kong. And with nothing in his pockets, he goes to work in a factory. He's 12 and beyond. But he works hard. He saves up. He eventually invests some money in the stock market, makes some money. And then he starts a company called Giordano, which ended up becoming a very successful apparel company, a factory and a chain of retail stores. He named it after a pizza chain he saw once. But then he became upset with the government of China. Don't forget, he's in Hong Kong, so at the moment it's okay. Hong Kong is under British control. This is pre-97. When the control shifts back to China under a 99-year lease that China and Britain had signed. So he is very moved by the what happens in Tiananmen Square in the 1980s, 89, I believe, when the Chinese government and army and police massacred people who were peacefully protesting for, democracy, freedom, just kind of some sort of say in who rules them. It was a touching thing at the time. There's the famous video, which you can find online if you haven't already seen it, of a single man. It actually seems to be holding some shopping bags, so maybe he was just out shopping, standing in front of a Chinese tank, a military tank, which is tries to get around them, and every time it moves to get to a different path, he walks over in front of the tank. I mean, it's a very moving thing. It's like, I'm going to stand in the way. Where, of course, that guy had no chance. But anyway, to get back to Lai, he's in prison now. They have harassed him. They've charged all kinds of things, charged him with all kinds of things, including a national security law. And it's a heartbreaking story. But the movie will, which was done by the Acton Institute, gives the whole story. And there are interviews with him from before the time of imprisonment. I really want to draw attention to him. And the bottom line on this that I really want to drive home to people is that libertarians, non-interventionists, anti-war people should feel free. I'm talking about now, not the government, but we should feel free to criticize foreign tyranny as much as we criticize incursions on American liberty here by the U.S. government, as full-throated in a way as possible. That goes for Russia, that goes for China, that goes for Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, without letting ourselves therefore be sucked into any kind of pro-interventionist position. In other words, you can hate these regimes, you can oppose these regimes in what you write, what you say, and make sure you're not mistaken for being a member of the pro-war chorus. And I think we need to think about Jimmy Lai.
Excellent. I was not familiar with that story. I will check it out. My next one is from a gentleman named Roland G. Fryer, a professor at Harvard University, one of the youngest ever in the economics department to get tenure. And he has a paper titled An Empirical Analysis of Racial Differences in Police Use of Force. In the abstract, he says, on the most extreme use of force, officer-involved shootings, we find no racial differences in either the raw data or when contextual factors are taken into account. So just as we see a great disparity in gender when it comes to police shootings, men are half the population, yet 90% of those shot by police. That is not evidence of discrimination when you take into account the fact that men are more violent on average than women. So it's actually something we'd expect. We also see a big age gap. Younger people under 35 are more likely to be shot than people older than 35. This also is not the result of discrimination when you take into account many other factors. Here is Roland Fryer summarizing his research.
A few years ago, you dropped the equivalent of a nuclear bomb with a study that you published.
I thought this was going to be the easiest paper I'd ever written in my entire career. I was so biased against the police myself, frankly. So I thought, this is clear. I'm going to get some data. I'm going to show the police are discriminating. So what we did is we collected millions and millions of data points across the country. So we did that, and what we found was that there are large racial differences in lower level uses of force, putting hands on people, throwing them up against a car, etc. Someone sent me a note and said, oh, this, lower level uses of force don't matter because, I thought it was about black lives. This is, who cares if they get pushed up against a car? And I wrote back, could you give me your address? I'll come push you up against the car. See how you feel about it. We collected data on 18 cities on actual shootings. In any way we cut the data, there were no racial differences in shootings. People lost their minds. It is these 12 videos or so, or 15 that we've seen that are horrific, don't get me wrong, are just not what the data tell you. What we found in the data is that when an investigation is announced, the police pull back and then crime goes up. So what we estimate is that for the three awful shootings and lives that we lost, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and Laquan McDonald, where there were investigations, those investigations caused 1,000 additional lives lost.
It's really devastating when you realize that the state is given a monopoly on violence, and they're told that when a police officer tells you to do something, you must obey them, or they have the right to forcibly restrain you. And then if you resist, then they have the right to shoot you. People look at this. They also understand that you have to fund the police, or else the police will arrest you and put you in jail and shoot you if you resist, then. And they look at that situation and say, I bet skin color has a lot to do with this issue right here. It's an economic issue. It's a moral issue. The race issue is a complete distraction. Thanks so much to people like Roland Fryer and Wilfred Riley for getting the truth out about this issue. Sheldon, next one. How do people value money because they need it to pay taxes?
Yeah, this was actually sort of a fun, in some ways a bit technical, but don't worry about that. It was called it's the Human Action Podcast, which is hosted by Bob Murphy, who is a very good economist, and his guest here is Per Bieland, who is also an economist. I forget where he teaches. Oh, Oklahoma State. It says it right there. And Bieland was got in a tangle on Twitter with some representatives of the modern monetary theory school, which these are the people, if you heard anything about them, and by the way, I want to say I'm very far from being an expert on monetary theory, so I am not representing myself as an expert, but I kind of know it can make sense. The people, during our age of very high government debt and deficit spending, the loudest chorus saying we don't have to worry about any of that are this relatively new group, I guess, of modern monetary theorists. Well, they got into a tangle with Bieland, and I think Murphy's also tangled with them, but they wanted to talk about it because Mike Bieland's now written a paper on this, which he'll talk about in this, and also you'll see the link to it on this YouTube site. The MMT people, who I think of as empty people, are arguing that money, the only reason we even have dollars is because the government requires that you send them in taxes. And so we ought to be very happy that government spends money, because that's putting dollars into the economy, into private hands, which we will need on tax day. It seems laughable. It's hard to believe that intelligent people with college degrees and advanced degrees, PhDs, believe this, but they apparently say it. And Bieland has written a paper now because they invited him to write a paper. They said, "Show us where we're wrong." So he took them up. As of this podcast, he was waiting to hear a comment on the paper. He hadn't gotten any yet, but they totally destroy this thesis that the only reason we use dollars are because we're going to need them on tax day. And of course, one thing they point out is even if let's say the government, so the government requires dollars on tax day. That's certainly true. It does require dollars. I don't think it wants you to pay in anything else. It won't let you pay in anything else. But it doesn't follow from that we use dollars on our everyday transactions with stores and other people. If the only real need for them was taxes, we would just use our other money, our real money, our market money, to buy dollars, in an exchange market around the time we needed them, and we buy only what we needed and then send it in. So this is not questioning taxation. I mean, that's not the point of their conversation. They would question it, but they're not doing it here. So that doesn't make any sense. And it seems to me that, I can imagine, they don't say this, but I can imagine a situation where the government had collected taxes, but did not issue money. I mean, that's certainly conceivable. Maybe it's never happened before, but imagine it could tax, it does tax, but it doesn't issue money. So money is purely a market thing. The taxes the government would want taxes payable in the most tradable medium of exchange, or the one or two most traded. They want, because what the government wants is not dollars per se; it wants purchasing power. It wants to take it from us so it has it, because it doesn't want to borrow the whole budget. So it's a fun conversation. I think it's very, very clear. There may be a technical point or two that maybe even I had trouble with, but no, these guys are very good communicators, and I recommend it if you're interested in current controversies in money.
My final one, the non-existent difference between National Socialism and democratic socialism. Here we have a picture of one of the most popular democratic socialist academics, Richard Wolff, along with Richard Spencer, someone who identifies as a National Socialist. The summary of the point I'm trying to make is that National Socialism and democratic socialism both advocate institutionalized violence by the state against peaceful people and only differ in rhetoric. It's important because you hear people like Bernie Sanders and AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib talk about how democracy is really important. So they're not nationalists, they're just about democracy. Yet I have yet to hear them say it's really important that China, India, Brazil, and Russia do the following policies, and they should be able to vote in American elections, and we should actually have a world government where 7 billion people vote every year. That's actually democratic. They are, however, nationalists because they focus mainly on America, and there's nothing wrong with this, but they think they're so uppity when they say that nationalism's something bad, and then they focus primarily on their own nation state. So here are some of the other similarities that both of these groups have. They both advocate the existence of a state apparatus which has a legal monopoly on the right to initiate violence, also known as government supremacy, the state monopolizing the money supply, central bank, state compulsory education, state regulation of economic activity between consenting adults, antitrust laws, commercial and occupational licensing, higher taxes on the rich, tariffs, immigration restrictions, both consistently vilify the banks and big business, see National Socialist 25-point program, taxation, the right of the state to coercively collect its funding in a manner which no other group has the right to, state police, which is why defund the police was clearly a scam. They know the state needs police to enforce regulations and taxes, which they impose on us. State military apparatus, not something every country has. Countries like Liechtenstein do not have a military. Private security is cheaper and more reliable. The state itself is an expropriating property protector, contradiction in terms, and both constantly obsess over race and explicitly judge people by skin color. National Socialism and Democratic Socialism have very different talking points, and the crowds are very different in items that they focus on, but there is no principal difference between the two. Thank you all for watching the Libertarian Institute YouTube and Odyssey channel. Sheldon Richman, thank you for your time.
A pleasure.